I will discuss on the topic cultural movements in support of freedom struggle in India. We see that the communist inspired cultural activism in India as well as in Bengal during the period 1936 to 52 greatly stimulated the creative talents of the Indians as well as the Bengalis, and at the same time induced a kind of social and political commitment in writers and artists. In fact, the cultural scene of Bengal as well as India had been showing a distinct change of attitude since the end of the First World War. Now the question is that in which context All India Progressive Writers Association was formed in relation to the cultural movement in India, as this organization was one of the major proponents of this movement. With the maturing of the freedom movement, the awakening of peasants and workers within the outside of the Gandhian movement, the growth of fascism abroad, and the global depression and so on, writers and artists could no longer live in their ivory tower. The middle class to which they belonged was itself engulfed by a deepening crisis. The growing communal bitterness at both the elite and popular levels was also quite disturbing. We find the European economy at that time of moment had been facing several structural pressures, and political uncertainties had been growing since the war. The net territorial aggressions by the fascist force of Germany, Italy, and Japan shocked common people everywhere. On the whole, an awareness of the social, economic, national and international problems, a courage to face them and to examine them in some depth was gradually developing in the cultural and intellectual arena. Socialism that had been slowly forcing its way into Bengal since the Bolshevik Revolution played a more or less important role in the growth of this consciousness. A warm admiration for the Soviet experiment and a left-oriented worldview was shared by a large section of Bengali intellectuals of that time, and not only by those who called themselves communist. They showed an urge to integrate the struggle for political freedom with the socio-economic aspirations of the poor, as well as with the worldwide struggle against imperialism and its most rabid manifestation of fascism. And in this context, we will discuss All India Progressive Writers Association's emerge. It was in April 1936 that All India Progressive Writers Association was formed in Lucknow under the initiative of some left-minded youths, inspired by the international anti-fascist resistance movement that reputed intellectuals like Rolland and Gorky had been organizing for quite some time. Now the question is that the time, in what year All India Progressive Writers Association was emerged. It was in April 1936 in Lucknow. And now we came to the main point that this cultural movement was a broad-based movement consisting of left radicals, left liberals, but also many not so left and non-left intellectuals and writers standing against fascism and to that extent believing in the interconnectedness between art and politics and aligning themselves with the communist. Thus, the new culture was given an organized shape and gradually crystallized into a cultural movement with strong national and international links. It was a movement in the sense that it was based on the perception of a set of common goals by a collectivity, at least a sense of collective commitment. Hundreds of writers and intellectuals joined this movement, responding to the troubled times and the intensified political climate in home and abroad, agonizing over the grim of socio-political reality and realizing the wide possibilities of creative practices afforded by the All India Progressive Writers Association project. They united on this platform in the cause of anti-fascist resistance in particular and human progress in general. Indeed, they called themselves as progressive. They all paid attention to current problems, and almost all of them tried to enter the hard lives of the poor and ordinary people. New themes led to bold experiments spanning a range of art forms at the hands of a set of idealistic people, middle class in origin but sensitive to the problems of the poor and downtrodden. They did not want their movement to remain the mere intellectual and aesthetic exercise of a handful of middle class people, but set themselves the objective of reaching down to the masses through their cultural activities and inspiring the fight for a better society. Now, after this discussion about All India Progressive Writers Association, we will turn into the subject on Indian People's Theatre Association, which was also one of the major proponents of this cultural movement. And now the question is that how one may define the Indian People's Theatre Association as an effective weapon in the fight for national liberation from British imperialism. The time was 1940s and 1950s. As the decade of the 1940s began amid the Second World War and piled ruin on Bengal and the world, the cultural movement went from strength to strength. This demanding period, the war, the Japanese air raids on Assam and Chittagong, the Quit India movement, even though the communists opposed it, the traumatic Bengal famine, the final collapse of fascism, the final and most militant phase of the Indian freedom movement, communal riots, independence accompanied by partition, gradually stimulated these creative activities. Now, prominently came to the question of Indian People's Theatre Association. In 1942, a group of progressive writers who recognized the potential of theatre as an effective weapon in the fight for national liberation from British imperialism and also from fascism, and in the struggles of peasants, workers and any other oppressed classes, formed a group called the Indian People's Theatre Association, that is IPTA. It not only provided a platform for dramatic and musical artists, but also pushed the boundaries of the communist cultural movement to include people lower down the social scale. The IPTA even tried to identify creative talent from among the peasants and workers. In Bengal, IPTA was part of the Anti-Fascist Writers and Artists Association, which included practitioners of pictorial art and sculpture too. So we find that the All India Progressive Writers Association, Indian People's Theatre Association, and also Anti-Fascist Writers and Artists Association and other cultural organization, also political organization of the communist, provided the organizational underpinning under this discussion. I shall try to examine the ways in which the drama division of the IPTA participated in the political process before independence in 1947. Through an innovative and experimental drama that derived its inspiration and ideas partly from Western countries and partly from Chinese practices, but was rooted in India's own cultural and social practices, the IPTA challenged existing hegemonic structures, both colonial and those intrinsic to Indian society. Inspired by those cultural challenges abroad, IPTA members turned to theatre as a political woman and amid the political turmoil at home. Created by the war in Europe, increasing repression from British imperialism and deepening nationalist sentiments manifested in the Quit India movement of 1942. Basically, in order to seek the widest possible mass basis for its activities, the IPTA turned into indigenous popular traditions of different regions such as Jatra of Bengal, Tamasha of Maharashtra and Burokatha of Andhra Pradesh. Given the linguistic, cultural and geographical diversity of this Indian subcontinent, choices about language, theatrical space and stylistic devices were important, involving as they did questions of viewership and audience. By presenting the same plays in a range of different languages, the IPTA organizers attempted to overcome the lack of cohesion among a heterogeneous populace. Most of the IPTA plays were performed in outdoor theatres such as the Kamgar Maidan in Bombay, which could accommodate up to 20,000 people. Similarly, stylistic considerations constituted an important feature of IPTA production. In Calcutta, for example, Nabanno, a play about the Bengal famine, was performed on a revolving stage to achieve the desired realistic effects for a citified audience viewing the lives of the Bengali peasants. Outside Calcutta, the same play had to be performed on makeshift stages, and much of the realism was derived not from a naturalistic stage but from use of the peasants' dialect. The details about village life and local traditions combined with Jatra songs and props. An adequate understanding of IPTA requires us to situate it against the backdrop of the historical development in Indian society during 1940s and 1950s. Some of the most talented figures from the world of theatre participated in the IPTA. Balraj Shahani, Shambhu Mitro, Bijon Bhattacharya, Anna Bahu Sathe and Khwaja Ahmed Abbas, to name only a few. Female IPTA members who were organizers, artists, playwrights, directors, and even protagonists of play made women's issue an important aspect of the IPTA program. Among these were Sheila Bhatia, Rashid Jahan, Binata Roy, Sarojini Naidu, and Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay. By 1944, the IPTA expanded into a cultural movement that included a central cultural troupe that organized dances and ballets on political issues, and provincial and regional units in Malabar, Andhra Pradesh, United Provinces, Assam, Punjab, and Delhi. Until around 1960, the IPTA presented hundreds of plays on a range of topics such as Japanese aggression on Southeast Asia, Hitler and Mussolini, war and fascism, the Bengal famine of 1943, the cholera epidemic of 1944, the problems of food, landlordism, debt, and workers' exploitation, and also the partition of 1947. The major IPTA play was Bijan Bhattacharya's Nabanno about the Bengal famine of 1943, which I have already mentioned. Now, I will discuss this elaborately. Under Shambhu Mitra's direction, this play Nabanno, the Bengal IPTA performed this play in many parts of the country as part of a festival called Voice of Bengal. The purpose of this festival was to collect money for the famine victim in rural Bengal. Nabanno presents the intensity of the famine through the starving family of a Bengali peasant named Pradhan Shamaddar. The range of disasters that the family goes through are emblematic of the state of the Bengali peasantry during the famine. Nabanno implicates a combination of the war in Europe and imperialist policies at home as being ultimately detrimental to the economically marginalized groups. Their choice to collectivity to relocate to Kolkata is an attempt to understand the politics of the famine. The title of the play, which actually translates as New Harvest, is symbolic of the new crop that will be generated through this reawakening of the peasant's consciousness. Now, after all this discussion, one may ask the question that what was the unique contribution of this cultural movement in support of the freedom struggle in India. The unique contribution of this Marxist cultural movement in India has been that artistic creation and appreciation is no more confined to that of intellectual elite, and it is important. And the growth of the organized working class, peasant class, and the peasant movement, working class movement, together with the movements of other sections of the working people, had awakened the millions of toilers not only to political consciousness but uplifted their aesthetic sensibilities and creative talents. I may point out here that the working people of Kerala produced in this period as many creative and critical works as were produced in other states of India. The bitter controversy that accompanied the setting up the Kerala unit of Progressive Writers Association in 1937 and the still more bitter controversies that raged in the 1940s between the communists and the others were no less intensive in Kerala than anywhere else. In Punjab, we find that it was mainly an agricultural community where the IPTA invoked the relationship between war and poverty through themes related to the food crisis during the war period, the impact of black marketing, and the hoarding of crops by the capitalist. The realistic themes pertaining to the contemporary political struggles were interspersed with folk devices such as songs and dances, puppets, clowns, and mimes, which were adjusted according to cultural specificity. According to the 1944 reports provided by the Punjab IPTA, the plays performed in Punjab on issues of national unity and anti-fascism emerged from discussions with workers and peasants and took into account the local histories, legends, religious beliefs, and traditions. The IPTA was not an undifferentiated phenomenon. It recognized the many layers of oppression that existed in society and sought to rectify the vexing wrongs committed against the marginalized classes. Through linguistic diversification, IPTA artists used the theatre as a vehicle for awakening a spirit of protest among the people that would merge into a collective anti-fascist and anti-imperialist consciousness. Thus, the IPTA inaugurated an alternative model of cultural production that became significant site of socio-historical struggle. The IPTA also changed the structure and conception of theatre in various parts of India by mobilizing plays that were constructed according to the socio-political environment. The IPTA altered the use of theatre from merely a means of entertainment to a forum for people's struggles. By performing for the rural and the non-literate public instead of a limited elite audience, the IPTA made political theatre available to those who previously had little or no access to it. However, while the IPTA provided exposure to women, dealt with the problems of female workers in the public spaces such as factories or tea plantations, and sought women's involvement in the movement, it rarely staged the problems confronting women in the domestic sphere. The IPTA left a strong legacy for political theatre groups in India. Most contemporary theatre groups draw on the IPTA's concept of a travelling theatre for propagating political activism. This group include, among others, numerous theatre groups in Calcutta, one of the largest centers of political theatre activity in India, Karnataka's community theatre Shomudayo, that was formed by R.P. Prasanna in 1975 during the state of emergency to campaign against Indira Gandhi. The Association of Rural Poor in Tamil Nadu, composed mainly of Dalits, untouchable pupils, landlords, farm workers, and the cultural caravans in Kerala. In this time, that is the 1930s and 1940s, we see that Bengal saw a veritable resistance in the cultural fields. It involved talents like Manik Bandopadhyay, Tara Shankar Bandopadhyay, Noni Bhomik, and Gopal Haldar in prose, Bishnu De, Shamor Sen, Subhash Mukherjee, and Shukanta Bhattacharya in poetry, Monoranjan Bhattacharya, Shambhu Mitra, and Bijan Bhattacharya in theatre, Jyotirindra Moitra, Sholil Chaudhuri, Debobrata Bishwas, and Hemanta Mukherjee in music, Chittaprasad Bhattacharya, Somnath Hor, Paritosh Sen in pictorial art, to name only a few. I would like to reiterate that all of these writers and artists who assembled under the banner of this cultural movement, some were predisposed towards communism and some grew up to be close or part of the communist movement. But not all of them had a strong partisan identity. Though most were more or less sympathetic to the communist cause, or at least to the way the Soviet Russia was fighting Hitler. One could simply contend that the movement well served the need of the times, particularly for the middle class. Instead, the cultural movement helped sensitize them to the current problems and indeed made them address some of those problems, albeit in a small way. The cultural movement under discussion, a response to a particular historical context, definitely stands out in the cultural history of the Indian middle class. So we came to the conclusion that the communists during the 1930s and 1940s did try to forge a broad-based cultural movement, but by destroying the movement very early, they left their hegemonic aspirations unfulfilled. Culture is of course useful in preparing people for big social changes. Communist politics without a cultural dimension can indeed be very barren. A cultural intervention in society is imperative for communism, but that is culture in a very broad sense and not just literary, performative and pictorial practices. This narrow kind of culture without a real political mission can be quite useless or even harmful as far as communism is concerned. Thank you.